London, late 1943. The war has already reached the city in visible ways. Bomb damage is still present. Rationing continues. An industry is strained but functioning. Yet inside the Bank of England, the concern is not immediate destruction. It is something quieter. Financial analysts begin to notice irregularities in circulation. At first, they are small, isolated banknotes that raise questions but not alarms. The British pound, one of the most trusted currencies in the world, has remained stable despite years of war. Its reliability is critical, not just for Britain, but for trade across allied nations. But now, certain notes appear too precise. The paper feels correct, the ink matches official standards, and the typography is exact. Even the serial numbers follow legitimate patterns used by the bank itself. There is no obvious flaw to identify, and that is the problem, because these notes were not issued by the Bank of England. They were forged, not the kind produced by small criminal networks or opportunistic counterfeiters, but something far more organized. By late 1943, British authorities begin to suspect that this is not an isolated issue. The number of forged notes increases, particularly in high denominations such as £5, £10, and £20, values significant enough to influence financial movement, but not so large as to immediately trigger suspicion. Investigations begin to widen, and intelligence services are brought in. This is no longer about fraud, because to replicate British currency at this level requires resources, coordination, and technical expertise beyond what any private group could sustain during wartime. The question becomes more specific. Who has both the capability and the intention to undermine a national currency during a global conflict? The answer leads away from London, beyond neutral territories, and into the structure of Nazi Germany. What British analysts are beginning to uncover is not just a counterfeiting operation, but a coordinated effort initiated years earlier designed to exploit a fundamental vulnerability, not in military defense, but in economic trust. An operation that does not aim to destroy cities, but to weaken the system that sustains them. By the early 1940s, the war has expanded beyond the movement of armies and the control of territory. It is no longer defined solely by what happens on battlefields. It now extends into industry, transportation networks, intelligence systems, and into the structure that sustains all of them, finance. For Britain, this structure is essential. Since the outbreak of war in September 1939, the country has relied on a complex economic system to maintain its position. Imports of food, fuel, and raw materials continue despite the threat of German U-boats in the Atlantic. Weapons are produced at scale. International trade persists, even under strain. At the center of this system is the British pound. It functions not just as currency, but as a guarantee. Across global markets, it represents stability and allows Britain to purchase critical supplies from allies, particularly from the United States before its formal entry into the war in December 1941. Agreements such as Lend-Lease further reinforce this network, but even these depend on financial credibility and long-term trust. Inside London, institutions continue to operate under pressure. The Bank of England maintains currency production and oversight. Financial markets adapt to wartime conditions. Despite restrictions, controls, and rationing, the system does not collapse. Even during the height of the Blitz, when sustained air raids damaged large parts of the capital, the financial core remained intact. Buildings are destroyed, and infrastructure is disrupted, but the underlying confidence in the pound endures. From this experience, a belief takes hold within British leadership that the economy, like the military, can absorb damage and continue functioning. Currency can be regulated. Markets can be stabilized. Institutions can adapt. This belief becomes an assumption. And like many assumptions formed under pressure, it is rarely tested directly, because it depends on a condition that appears unshakable. That the currency itself is secure. That every banknote in circulation can be trusted without hesitation. That authenticity is absolute. Inside Nazi Germany, this assumption is not accepted. It is examined. As early as the late 1930s, German security and intelligence services begin to explore unconventional methods of warfare, approaches that do not rely on direct confrontation. Among them is the idea of economic disruption through counterfeiting. The logic is methodical. If British currency can be reproduced at a high enough standard, it could be introduced into circulation in significant quantities, not necessarily to replace the pound, but to weaken confidence in it. Because currency does not function solely on material value. It functions on belief. If banks begin to question deposits, if businesses hesitate to accept payment, if individuals doubt the notes in their hands, then transactions slow. And when transactions slow, the system itself begins to strain. This is not immediate collapse. It is gradual erosion, a form of pressure applied not to infrastructure, but to trust. From the German perspective, this represents a different kind of offensive, one that does not require air superiority or territorial gain, one that targets the internal stability of an opponent rather than its external defenses. By the early 1940s, this concept is no longer theoretical. It is being developed into a structured operation, planned, resourced, and refined within the German state. What British leadership continues to view as a stable foundation is, in reality, being identified as a point of vulnerability. If you're enjoying this video so far, please like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us make more content like this. The concept of attacking an economy through its currency is not unique to the Second World War. But in this case, it evolves from theory into a structured state operation. Early in the war, German intelligence agencies had already experimented with forged British banknotes. These initial efforts, often associated with earlier projects such as Operation Andreas, produced results that were usable but limited. The notes were not consistently accurate. Paper quality varied. Serial numbers were often incorrect. Detection, while not immediate, remained possible. By 1942, this approach is evolved. Instead of producing usable forgeries, the goal became something more precise: to replicate British currency so accurately that it becomes indistinguishable from the original. This transformation leads to the creation of what becomes known as Operation Bernhard. The project is reorganized under the authority of Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, and placed under the direction of Bernhard Kruger, a specialist in technical operations within the SS structure. The location selected for the operation is the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, north of Berlin. Here, within a segregated section of the camp, the operation begins to take shape. The objective is no longer limited to introducing counterfeit currency into circulation in small quantities. It is systemic. The plan is to produce British pounds at scale, millions of notes, and introduce them into the global financial system in a way that avoids immediate detection but gradually erodes trust. To achieve this, the technical challenge is significant. British banknotes at the time are complex. They rely on high-quality rag paper, specific ink compositions, and detailed engraving techniques. Serial numbers are carefully structured, and subtle variations exist between print runs. To replicate this system requires more than imitation. It requires reconstruction. Paper must be manufactured to match British standards in weight, texture, and durability. Ink formulas must be analyzed and reproduced with precision. Printing plates must capture fine details down to microscopic levels. Even the wear patterns, how notes age over time, must be considered. This is not counterfeiting in the traditional sense. It is industrial replication. And for this, the SS requires a workforce with highly specialized skills. The solution is found within the camp system itself. At Sachsenhausen, prisoners are selected based on their professional backgrounds. Among them are printers, engravers, typographers, artists, and bankers. Many of them arrested across occupied Europe, including Austria, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. A significant number are Jewish prisoners already targeted by the regime. These individuals are transferred into a separate, controlled section of the camp, Block 19, later expanded to Block 18. Their conditions differ from the general camp population. They are provided with better food, given access to tools and materials, and are allowed to work in heated environments. But these conditions are not a privilege, because their survival is directly tied to their output. Failure, whether through error, delay, or sabotage, carries immediate consequences. The environment is tightly controlled. SS guards monitor progress. Production is evaluated constantly, and secrecy is enforced at all levels. Despite these constraints, the prisoners begin to achieve results. By late 1942 and in 1943, the quality of the forged notes improves significantly. Paper composition begins to match British standards. Printing clarity reaches near-authentic levels. Serial numbers are generated using patterns derived from genuine banknotes. At a technical level, the operation succeeds. The forged notes become difficult, often impossible, to distinguish from real currency without detailed forensic examination. This represents a shift in capability. For the first time, a state has developed the means to replicate another nation's currency at scale with a level of precision that challenges the integrity of the system itself. But production alone is not the final objective. The operation must move beyond the controlled environment of Sachsenhausen and intercirculation. They must pass through banks, businesses, and international markets without detection. Only then can the intended effect take hold. By 1943, Operation Bernhard is no longer experimental. It is active, and the question begins to change. Not whether the notes can be produced, but how and where they will be deployed. Inside the controlled environment of Sachsenhausen concentration camp, Operation Bernhard develops into something more than a production effort. It becomes a closed system designed to solve, refine, and perfect every limitation that had previously made large-scale counterfeiting unreliable. The prisoners assigned to the operation are not working from assumptions, but rather from original British banknotes. These notes are studied in detail, measured, dismantled, and analyzed. Every component is examined. The composition of the paper, layering of ink, alignment of engraved lines, and the structure of serial numbers. Each element presents a technical problem, and each problem must be solved with precision. British banknote paper, for example, is not standard pulp. It is produced from high-quality rag fibers, giving it a distinct texture and durability. Replicating this requires not only the right materials, but the correct manufacturing process. Pressure, drying time, and fiber distribution all affect the final result. Watermarks present another challenge. They are embedded during the paper-making process, not printed afterward. To reproduce them convincingly, the team must reconstruct the original method, ensuring that the watermark appears natural when held to light, not artificial or imposed. Then there is the issue of imperfection. Genuine currency is not mathematically identical across every note. Slight variations exist, small misalignments, minor inconsistencies in ink density, subtle wear over time. To produce a perfect forgery, these imperfections must also be replicated, because a note that is too perfect becomes suspicious. Over time, these challenges are addressed. By late 1943, the forged notes produced under Operation Bernhard reach a level of accuracy that challenges even trained observers. Bank officials, when presented with individual notes, often cannot distinguish them from genuine currency without specialized verification methods. This marks a turning point in the operation. The question of feasibility has been answered. Now the focus shifts to scale. Production increases steadily. Using printing presses installed within the camp, the prisoners begin to produce large quantities of forged British pounds, primarily in denominations of 5 pounds, 10 pounds, 20 pounds, and 50 pounds. Estimates suggest that by the later stages of the operation, millions of pounds have been printed, representing a substantial portion of the total currency in circulation at the time. The scale is not only technical, it is strategic, because the impact of such an operation depends not just on quality, but on distribution. Initially, German planners consider a direct approach. One proposal involves using aircraft to drop large quantities of forged notes over Britain. The idea is simple. Release the currency into populated areas, allowing it to be collected and spent, entering circulation unpredictably. But this method presents clear risks. The sudden appearance of large quantities of high-denomination notes could trigger immediate suspicion. Authorities might identify patterns, trace origins, and isolate the threat before it achieves its intended effect. The strategy is reconsidered. Instead of a visible disruption, a more controlled method is chosen. The forged currency is introduced gradually outside Britain itself. Across occupied Europe and neutral countries, the notes begin to move through financial channels. They're used to fund intelligence operations and provided to agents working in foreign territories. They are exchanged through intermediaries in neutral states such as Switzerland and Sweden. In these environments, the scrutiny applied to individual banknotes is lower. Transactions are frequent and verification is limited. This allows the counterfeit currency to integrate into the system without immediate detection, not as a sudden influx, but as a slow accumulation. Over time, the forged notes pass through hands across borders and into institutions. They become part of the broader financial flow. The objective is not immediate collapse. It is gradual erosion, because an economy does not fail only when it is overwhelmed. It can also weaken when uncertainty begins to spread. If enough counterfeit currency enters circulation, it introduces doubt. If doubt grows, confidence declines. And if confidence declines, the system begins to strain. Not visibly at first, but internally. By 1944, Operation Bernhard has achieved something unprecedented. It has created a mechanism capable of influencing an enemy's economy without direct confrontation. But the final outcome remains uncertain, because the success of the operation depends on a variable that cannot be fully controlled: whether the infiltration will remain undetected long enough to have an effect. Which raises a critical question. Can an economy be destabilized not by sudden shock, but slowly like an undetectable virus? By 1943 and in 1944, Operation Bernhard has achieved something technically remarkable. Inside Sachsenhausen concentration camp, millions of pounds in forged British currency have been produced with a level of precision that challenges detection. At a technical level, the operation succeeds. But war is not decided by technical success alone. It is decided by impact. And it is here that the limits begin to emerge. The total volume of counterfeit currency, while significant, estimated at over 100 million pounds by the end of the operation, represents only a fraction of the total money supply circulating within the British and global financial systems. It is enough to create concern, but not enough to overwhelm the system entirely. Distribution also remains constrained. The original concept, flooding Britain with forged notes, was never fully implemented. Instead, the currency circulates primarily through controlled channels across occupied Europe and neutral states. This limits its reach. It slows the rate at which the forged notes can influence the broader economy. And most importantly, it reduces the element of surprise, because over time, patterns begin to emerge. By late 1943, British authorities are no longer dealing with isolated irregularities. They are observing a trend. Inside the Bank of England, analysts and financial investigators begin to identify inconsistencies, subtle but repeatable. Certain high-denomination notes, particularly £5, £10, £20, and £50, appear in circulation with characteristics that raise concern. Individually, these notes are convincing, but collectively, they suggest something larger. In response, British financial institutions begin to adapt. Verification processes become more rigorous. Suspicious notes are isolated and examined more carefully. Patterns and serial numbers are tracked. The system, which had initially assumed the integrity of its currency, begins to adjust to the possibility of compromise. Then, a decisive step is taken. The Bank of England initiates changes to its banknote policy, gradually withdrawing certain high-denomination notes from circulation and redesigning others to reduce vulnerability. This is not a public acknowledgement of the operation. It is a controlled response. By altering the structure of the currency itself, the effectiveness of the forged notes is reduced. They remain in circulation, but their influence is contained. At the same time, the broader strategic situation begins to shift. By 1944, Nazi Germany is under increasing pressure on multiple fronts. In June, Allied forces land in Normandy. In the east, Soviet offensives advance rapidly. Industrial capacity is strained, and supply lines are disrupted. Within this environment, priorities change. Resources, materials, personnel, and attention are redirected toward immediate military needs. Operation Bernhard continues, but its strategic importance declines. What had once been considered a potential tool for large-scale economic disruption is now one operation among many, competing for limited resources in a deteriorating war effort. The outcome becomes clearer. The operation has demonstrated that currency can be replicated and economic systems can be targeted, but it has also revealed a limitation. An economy of sufficient scale, supported by adaptive institutions, cannot be easily destabilized by infiltration alone, especially when that infiltration is gradual and constrained. What was intended as a decisive economic weapon becomes, instead, a contained threat, not because it failed technically, but because the system it targeted proved capable of responding. By early 1945, the structure that had sustained Operation Bernhard begins to collapse alongside the wider war effort. Across Europe, Nazi Germany is under sustained pressure. In January, Soviet forces launched the Vistula-Oder offensive, advancing rapidly toward Berlin. In the west, Allied forces cross into German territory. Industrial regions are lost. Transport networks are disrupted. Within this environment, long-term operations lose priority. Operation Bernhard, once considered a strategic tool, is now a liability. Its existence must be concealed. And inside Sachsenhausen concentration camp, the dismantling begins. Printing equipment is prepared for destruction. Documents are removed or burned, and production slows, then stops. The objective is no longer continuation, but erasure. Large quantities of counterfeit British currency, along with printing plates and materials, are transported out of the camp. By the spring of 1945, as Allied forces approach, these materials are moved south into Austria. There, in a remote region near the Austrian Alps, a final decision is carried out. Crates filled with forged banknotes are dumped into Lake Toplitz. The lake, deep and difficult to access, is chosen for its isolation. The intention is clear: to ensure that the operation leaves no trace that could be immediately recovered or analyzed. At the same time, the prisoners who had carried out the work are evacuated from Sachsenhausen. They are transferred through a series of movements as the front lines shift, eventually reaching other camps, including Ebensee in Austria. Their survival is uncertain, but unlike many others within the camp system, a number of these individuals remain alive at the end of the war. In May 1945, as Germany surrenders, Allied forces begin to uncover fragments of what had taken place. Interrogations follow. Testimonies are recorded. Former prisoners describe the structure of the operation, the selection process, the controlled working conditions, the technical challenges they were forced to solve, and the scale of production. What had been a highly secretive program begins to take form in documented history. In the years that follow, recovery efforts at locations such as Lake Toplitz bring additional evidence to the surface. Bundles of counterfeit notes preserved underwater, confirming the scale of the operation described by survivors. What emerges is a clearer understanding of one of the most sophisticated counterfeiting efforts ever undertaken. An operation designed not for immediate profit, but for strategic effect. By the time it is fully revealed, however, its moment has already passed. The war was meant to influence has ended, and the system it targeted has endured. Operation Bernhard demonstrates both the potential and the limits of economic warfare. It shows that even highly sophisticated methods, capable of replicating the very instruments of trust, can fall short when confronted by institutions that remain functional under strain. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment, like, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us make more videos like this. Until next time, my history lovers,